putting together a presentation for me is a creative exercise, because you've got all these component parts, which if you fit them together, it's a bit like Lego actually. You can create a whole that has got high impact. And I've been focusing much more in the last few years on making emotional connections with people. So in other words, you appeal to the emotional side of the brain, which is what some of the right wing are doing just now. They're doing exactly that, unfortunately. And in doing that, you have to use a different kind of technique, because it used to be about speaking to the logical brain. So it's about, this is the information I've got to give. This is the order that I want to put it in. And this is how I'm going to start it, and this is how I'm going to finish it. And these are the main points I want to make. Am I right? That's a very traditional. But as soon as you start speaking to people's logical brain, there's a kind of resistance, because they think, I'm going to look at this and I'm going to, think about it before I respond. If you appeal to the emotional side of the brain, there's actually a really good Arabic saying, which is that you want your audience to see with their ears. Right? So you're appealing to some kind of sensory part of the whole listener experience, and that allows you to play about with things. So I want to try and just go through what I do now, which is very different from what I did a few years ago, which was about structure, tone of voice, and working out just how to start with a bang and finish with a bang, right? That was the traditional thing. And now I think, because there's so much competition and people are going on to social media, there's so much more drama and hyperbole, isn't there? So in a sense, we have to reach just beyond that. I think, David, you commented, I did a speech in Dundee last Friday, and I called it, and those who are not English, who are not Scottish, the word gallus is a kind of cocky, swaggering confidence with humility that is a uniquely Scottish, particularly Glaswegian thing. So I put this big sign up, the big slide behind me was, super gallus, optimistic, let's be more audacious. Right? And when I sent it through to the organizer, I just got a thing back saying, wow. I mean, that as a title for a talk. And it reminded me of things like, drink a pint of milk a day, or beans means Heinz, stuff that you get in the advertising industry where you can do anything with words. And Murray Walker, the old Formula One racing commentator, he was the guy that came up with drink a pint of milk a day, because he was a copywriter. Just as a matter of an aside. So I'm looking at this as a kind of Play-Doh. Okay, so the first thing is, what is the key message you want to get across? Now, the clearer you could be about that, the better. Some people will go to 5 messages. I think it takes a very experienced speaker to do 5 messages. And I think in this world of social media and direct communication, I try to go for one single message, which I'm going to give you an example in a moment. Someone else coming in, sorry. So I'm on this thing just now, and it does fit in with a super gallus, optimistic, let's be more audacious, is about creativity. And, you look at the narrative just now, and it's dead in the water, isn't it? Politics, it's dead in the water. No one listens, no one trusts, no one gets excited, inspired by it. That tells you we've reached a kind of, so someone else trying to get in there, a kind of dead zone. And, the first politician who's going to really burst through that is going to be quite successful. But we've got into a situation where you don't say anything and you sound as if you're saying something, and people are left feeling kind of neutral, which is why the Farages and the Trumps have done really well, because they just do what they want and they don't sound like politicians. Am I right? I mean, Donald Donald Trump doesn't sound like anything in mammal form, I have to say, because he's gone ridiculous recently, really ridiculous. And so we are in an era where I think the business of speaking is becoming the most influential mechanism for communication now. You know, like it was back in the days of William Gladstone, who spoke at what is now Waverley Station. It was the old Waverley Market. And he spoke to, I think it was something like 4,000 people for 4.5 hours. 4.5 hours, and they were standing and they were taking every word in. You wouldn't get away with speaking for 4.5 hours now. Although Trump does it sometimes, but his audience is just so pumped up to love him and to kind of live in the glow of his almost religious symbolism now, that they will listen. So my approach, if I take the subject, for example, of creativity, now I think that we need people now to be much more solution focused. And we're still very much, this is my opinion, is what I talk about. So I want to get people to think about the wonders of creativity. And so how do you do that? Well, the only thing you can do is to give examples that are going to excite people so they see what you're talking about. So I will say, for example, that a 17-year-old guy called Kevin Richardson, because stories are good. Stories are good. There's more people coming in. They'll just keep getting to stuff. So this guy had an idea for a traffic light system that he believed would incentivize people to reduce their speeds and make it a bit of fun at the same time. So he touted it around everywhere, and he was backed by Volkswagen, who've got this kind of innovation core, this money they invest in innovation. And Stockholm came in and says, we'll try it. And they did try it. And how it worked was, if you went under the speed limit, big sign flashed up, it's got your registration plate, and it says, thank you for contributing to the, you've been entered for the speed lottery draw. Okay? If you go over the speed limit, it says, thank you for contributing to the speed lottery draw. So it was effectively saying to people, this is a bit of a game, but there's gains here and there are losses. But at least you know when you're losing, you're putting the money towards, someone else's delight. Anyway, speeding came down by an average of 22% over 6 months. So it worked. It worked. You say that Finland had a worse cardiovascular health record than Scotland back in the 70s. I remember these conversations. People say, health in Scotland's terrible. And they'd say, well, at least we're not Finland. Now Finland is the healthiest country in the world by every single definition of measure. So, some of the things they did, they organised cholesterol measuring competitions between neighbourhoods. Wild. But people got into it, and it became quite competitive. They created the older people's playgrounds so that pensioners were encouraged to go and play on the playgrounds designed for them. And they also said to all the dairy farmers, because dairy products they're fattening. So it's contributing to the growth of bodies and weight. And so those are the techniques they use. And they said to the dairy farmers, we will give you berries. We want you to grow berries instead of, having cattle and producing milk and cheese and cream. So the dairy farmers were compensated. So there was an incentive for them to do that. So they all transferred quite quickly to this new regime. And now berries are part of the staple diet in Finland. It's one of the reasons that they're an extremely healthy nation. So even if you're getting a main course, you will find there's berries in there, just berries buried in the steak. And, our approach is still health education, information and surgeries, advertising campaigns on television, reminding people of how unhealthy they are rather than reinforcing how healthy they could be. You look at the adverts, it really does do that. Right? So do you get my point there? That all this messaging, it simply isn't working because there is no incentive, there's no fun, there's no kind of creative approach to it. And health is one of those things that are very personal. Most people think the game is finished for them. That's the attitude. If you, I remember doing this thing in Dundee where they had a particularly high rate of cancer. And guys in particular wouldn't go to the doctor. They'd say, well, if we've got cancer, we've got cancer. I don't want to know about it. And that kind of fatalism is something that exists in many societies. And Scotland is one of them. It's not unique, it's not on its own, but that means that we have to have something else with the message. So I always say, I want to inform, but I want to inspire people with the information that they get. And I want to angle the stories and the metaphors and the analogies in a way that gets people in the emotional side of their brain. So you take, let's think of the creativity message. So I've got something like 5 quick successive stories about how companies or countries or communities have made a dramatic difference by someone coming up with an idea, right? And then you also talk about the fact that these ideas were not hugely expensive to implement. It was just about people, their resourcefulness, and making sure that the right people knew. And putting a vision on it, a vision, rather than just, what we'd say is we want to reduce carbon emissions. You get huge objections from motorists who want to drive into Edinburgh and Glasgow with whatever year of car they've got. Am I right? Huge resistance. We saw a constituency in South London that went back to the Conservatives unexpectedly because of that. So we know that doesn't work. So the mayor of Curitiba in Brazil, he has transformed that city, transformed it. I mean, you would not believe. But his vision was a city designed for people. Now, not many people are going to argue with that. A city designed for people. And then he went about doing things, but looking at it from a creative point of view. He went to the slum dwellers and he said, I want you to recycle all your waste. Can you imagine the priority they would give to that? You were on the edge of survival. But he says, in exchange, I will give you food and football tickets. And I will get you engaged in building new homes that you will live in. You'll get trained up in the skills of construction. So, years later, 64% of the poorest part of the population are now employed in the lucrative construction industry. GDP went up, earnings went up. He also asked his operations department, how long will it take to pedestrianise the street? And they said, 3-6 months. And he said, no, I want it done in 48 hours. They did it in 48 hours. And on the Monday morning, there were no kids tethered to their parents. People were looking in the shop windows. They were spending a lot more money. And the whole place had a different cast about it, particularly around children and families. People sitting, eating their sandwiches under the protection of the tree. And all the neighbouring shopkeepers came and says, we want some of that. He also tackled things like plastic in the oceans. He said to the fishermen, if you bring back plastic you find in the ocean, I will give you money in exchange. So particularly for off-season, this is an incentive for you to do something for this city. They've created a transport system which is immaculate, and they've got parks ringing the whole city. I think the average 64.5 metres per citizen is the ratio of greenery to people, which is pretty good. So these people had something different. they knew they had to communicate in a different way. The first thing is not to take a vision as a negative thing. So, who's going to say, I don't want a city designed for me or my children? No one's going to argue that. So it's a positive vision, and it's a very simple one. Who doesn't want to live in a city designed for people? The mayor of Oklahoma woke up one morning and he was looking at the morning television. This is quite a few years ago, and they were looking at obesity statistics in America, and they found themselves number 5 on the list, Oklahoma City. So he gathered his the equivalent of councillors around him, and he says, we've got to do something. And someone said, let's get people to lose £1 million in the next 3 months. And they did. People actually rose to that challenge. Now people go to live in Oklahoma because it's a healthy place to live. It's got lots of parkland, it's got lots of cycle lanes, it's completely subverted the old style city with the car dominated and people were coughing up. So it shows you how simple it is. But it all started with the words, with the concepts. So when you've got your objective, when you've got what your message or messages are, then we look at how we can wrap things around them so that the story is an analogy or a metaphor. Talk about both of them. For example, if I told you back in the early days of Apple that Steve Jobs had said to his technical director when he brought in the latest iteration of the iPod, remember the iPod? Seems like an antique now. But he looked at it and he said, no, he says, I want to make it smaller. There's too much space being wasted in this. Can you imagine? He looked at the size of an iPod. So anyway, they went back and they came back again and they said, look, this is as far as we can go with it. Really, we can't go any further. We've completely condensed everything into this very tight space. Steve Jobs was standing beside a fish tank in the office, and he pushed the iPod into the fish tank, and these little bubbles started to appear. He said, see, there's still space there. Get rid of it. But if you tell that to people, it says something about his incredibly powerful focus on perfection and making the experience one that was unique. It's like the symbols they use. Microsoft didn't do it. Microsoft very successful getting computers going, but he said, look, I want, when you open your Apple, I want color, I want it to be intuitive, I want people to see things that they have on their desk, like an envelope, like paperclip, all those little, iconic things around how a person operates at the desk. So they transferred it all onto the computer. And it's that kind of fastidiousness. But of course, the Apple money people didn't like this because he was taking too long to go to market and he was spoofing about with trying to make things better than they were, right? So they got rid of him and then they had to bring him back again because the company started losing money because it had lost Steve Jobs. I mean, it is the thing that sold Apple to me was Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was this amazing man who had this vision, the real clarity around it, and his dedication to perfectionism and to the consumer experience. That was it. And when you feel that, you get a different relationship with the company. Now Apple's about money, and it's a multi-billion pound industry, and it's all about money. It's all about saving on the production costs. It's all about, adding, a few new things every year to make it a slightly updated version of the previous year, although they could probably produce the model for 5 years down the line today. But they won't do that because that's not profitable. So Steve Jobs had it, and he had some great words. But I go back to get your audience to see with their ears. Right, so let's just focus on that a minute. And this is where, stories become really, really important, because you can involve people in your stories. You can tell it in a way that gives enough detail that they feel they're in this space with you. So I was in South Beirut 2006, and it's very topical just now because things are looking very dangerous, but they'd been under 2 weeks of relentless missile attacks. And I arrived, a day after the bombing stopped. And the next day I got a driver, and I said, could you take me down to South Beirut? And it was horrible. I mean, you see the destruction. You don't, you see these images of what's happening in Ukraine and Palestine and now Beirut again, and you see them. But when you're there, there's a funny atmosphere. There's this sort of acrid atmosphere. You're breathing in the dust. It's hot. It's very hot. And every step you take, you need water, because all this dust, this concrete dust, is blowing into your mouth. And then you're looking around and you're seeing all the accoutrements of life, like children's toys, items of clothing, all kind of buried under the rubble. You see cars flattened completely under a great slab of concrete. And amidst all of this, I saw this guy who had clothes rails on the rubble, kind of flattened a bit, and he was selling clothing. And I thought, my God, the bombing only stopped 36 hours ago, and this guy's selling clothes. So I said to my driver, that's extraordinary. He says, well, that was his shop 2 days ago. So he was standing on top of the rubble of his shop. So I went up to him and I said, it must have been horrible to lose your shop. And he shrugged his shoulders and he said, I'm not a shopkeeper. I give people style and confidence. And I thought, wow, that's purpose, isn't it? And I thought, I've actually found a real living example of purpose that is kind of completely outside my sphere of activity. And anyway, I went back to the main road. And I said to the driver, I says, that was a real road to Damascus moment for me. And he said, actually, you are on the road to Damascus. So it's got a wee funny tail end. But people understand that story. They understand it. They get what purpose is. It's about this personal, driver that you cannot be deflected from. And then you think, well, can we expand that? Because this thing about purpose is really important, because people give up, or they think, my business is running a restaurant, or my business is having a clothes shop. But actually, if you strip away those accoutrements of the business, they're essentially about giving people style of confidence. In the case of the restaurateur, the clothes seller. And we saw during COVID how some of the much near almost Michelin star quality restaurants started sending out freezer packs with all the ingredients, with the sauces, so you do it yourself, and they send the recipes, and it was really successful. And some of the restaurants, I think there's one in St Andrews, as an ex-MasterChef winner, who made more money through COVID than he did when the restaurant was flying. So they were able to say, our job is to excite people's taste buds. And, this shouldn't stop us doing it. Just because we can't open the restaurant doesn't mean we don't have a going business. And actually, we'll be offering something that people will love. And it worked for them. So that's how stories, that's a metaphor. The Beirut story is a metaphor for what we mean by purpose. It really does. It's a driven something that you can't easily explain intellectually. If you try to explain in an abstract way what purpose is, you'd get a wee bit stuck, wouldn't you? Trying to explain it. So that's the beauty of wrapping it in something like that. But then you've got to look at, you know, are there any other things we can add in there? Small stories. Can you use a bit of humor? You know, I do say when I go to bed at night, my purpose is to make sure I wake up to the toilet, because I'm probably going about 5 or 6 times during the night, man of my age, right? And, you know, people get a bit of light relief. So you can take this topic and you can just spice in and splice it. I always think that I worked for BBC Radio Scotland at one stage, not for very long, but you soon work out that you never see a documentary, you never hear a broadcast on a subject that does it in a linear way, do you? It always starts with someone saying, I would never have trusted him. I thought there was something wrong with the man. You know what I mean? And then it goes into the story and they build up the characters. And I mean, Netflix are brilliant at documentaries. They really are. They've got some great ones and they're really compelling. I prefer them now to films, particularly, you know, as if it's 4 or 5 episodes. I love that. But what they do is they take the story and they'll put it in an order that keeps you gripped. Does that make sense? You never know what's going to happen next. You don't even know who the murderer is. I saw one recently and you were right on the edge of your seat till the very end when it was revealed that it was the other woman that was the murderer. I don't know if you saw that one. Oh, are you going, Tracy? No, something's come up for her. So this is about the order and about how you use those stories and how you create almost a film. You know, you want to get people to see with their ears. So I've got another technique which I use, which is to imagine the music that I would have playing in the background to what I'm saying. You know, if you start off with a kind of deep bass, and then you go do 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 do, you know, and you can actually adapt what you're saying to a meter that goes with this music that you think would fit absolutely. So imagine it with a backtrack and the music changes. And it's about drama, it's about building up drama, it's about painting pictures in people's minds, it's about creating characters and making sure that the stories have a point to them, not just gratuitous stories, because stories are incredibly valuable, because they are going to people's emotional part of their brain, and the emotional part retains things because you've tapped into their sensory organs. You know, if I say, you know, I was going down, you know, Leith Walk last Friday night, which I wasn't, by the way, just before anyone, you know, pipes up with, I saw you and I know you were up to no good. And I smelled the smell of fresh baking. It's true, isn't it? There's a baker that keeps baking into the night on Leith Walk. And Edinburgh used to be like that. The smell of fresh baking. Everyone remembers that. And people will start to smell it. It is that evocative. It's like the smell of ground coffee, which you used to have in Princess Street and in Dublin, where you walk down Grafton Street, you walk along Princess Street, and as soon as you got near to Melrose's or Bewley's in Dublin, the smell of ground coffee, it was beautiful. And then you got closer and then you realise they're also baking bread and cakes in the morning for their breakfast. And that is what appeals to people's senses. You can take any subject and find a way of communicating that topic, that piece of information that is just a bit different. So you can you can back it up afterwards. You say the figures back all this up, but if you show a page of statistics and graphs, you lose about 60% of the audience, because a lot of people like me hate graphs. I don't have that kind of brain to compute it. But if you say, you know, this is a stat which is absolutely true, that the UN budget has stayed pretty steady for the last few years. The one thing that's gone up is expenditure on arms, weapons. So now the annual expenditure on weapons is 700 times the UN budget. So you could argue, you could say, well, does that mean that we're spending 700 times more on ways to kill people than we are investing in peace? Well, the answer is, I'm afraid, yes. But that sticks in people's minds. It's one of those things. You know, numbers are fascinating, because if you want to demonstrate numbers, there are ways of doing it. You know, think of how you can take a measurement and put it into something else, so you create a different kind of picture image. I remember in Glasgow, I was in this company that did lots of stuff around the city, and we've been insulating homes around the city for years. It's called Heatwise, and I think we're up to something like 76,000 homes around the city. But this kind of constant, you know, next week it's going to be 77,000, the week after it's going to be 78,000, and it didn't excite people who worked in the organisation anymore. It had lost its impact. And also, you know, you're sending it out to the press, the same, you know, now, you know, Heatwise has insulated, you know, 78,000 homes around the city. The impact of this is, you know, massive reductions in the amount people are paying for fuel, and an improvement in the health of people with bronchial and asthmatic conditions. So one day I said to the guy, Norrie, who was the production manager, I said, Norrie, I'm going to ask you a big favour, and I knew he would actually like this challenge. I want you to measure, not actually measure, but take all of the insulation we've laid, you know, in roofs, in doors, in windows, and add it all up, end to end. How far would that go? So, you know, it took him about 5 days, and he came back and he said, I think it was 4,500 miles. I said, well, wow, that's a lot. And so we got a map out, a map of Europe, and we had, you know, the scale thing, working out where this might stretch from to, and we found out it would stretch from Motherwell to Moscow. And that sets an image in your mind. It gives a sense of scale. And the press loved it. They absolutely loved it. It became, and also the people who worked for the organisation would say, you know, we've done enough insulation that if you read it end to end, it would stretch from Motherwell to Moscow, by the way. So that's the power of language, and it's the power of imagery, and it's the power of taking, you know, if you say we're going to spend another £4.5 billion this year, no one pays any attention to that. A lot of people are coming out and going in. I wonder what's. So numbers don't mean anything. They really don't mean anything to people, unless, you know, they're accountants. And by the way, you know, accountants are incredibly useful people, but I'm not sure they always should run the companies, because there was this time in the 80s and the 90s where accountants became directors. You saw it in local authorities, in the NHS, you saw it in companies. Say, well, appoint the finance director because he knows about money. But life in business is more than just money. So what would happen is that the focus on the kind of spreadsheet would determine how a company or an organisation is going. Now, here's a way of demonstrating the folly of that. That A, you're in deficit all the time. So you see the numbers at the end of the month, and then you discuss the position, right? So you're too late to have done anything about the last 4 weeks. If you picked it up earlier, you might have been able to. But the other thing is that this focus on the spreadsheet takes your eye off other things, like what the competition's doing. What ideas are there out there to pick up on? And we tend not to, employ enough people with that kind of end in mind. Look, you are part of this organization. We want you to look out for ideas, to look at what other people are doing, to test things that you see, and to come back with those ideas and see if we can work them up. But they tended not to do that. So you had these very traditional companies, and the best analogy I had for it was, someone said to me, it's a bit like a tennis player who is looking at the scoreboard rather than his or her opponent. It's true, isn't it? And I've seen it twice in the last few days in the Olympics. Last night it was a Scottish guy, Josh Kerr, whose main rival was this Norwegian, and they have this pretty competitive rivalry, not always nice to each other. And his thing was to make sure that he got past the Norwegian, which he did, and he was obviously going to ease past him quite easily. And what he didn't see was an American coming in the inside lane, because he wasn't programmed to look at the American, the inside lane. And on the sprint the other day, was it Noah Lyles, an American, amazing runner. But they had Thompson, the Jamaican runner, who was an extraordinary powerhouse, who has just won everything in sight for the last year. But he seemed to have lost Lyles. Lyles was way back. He seemed to have lost him. So he was focused on the person just on his outside, who was keeping quite close. So he completely lost sight of Lyles and beat the guy beside him. And Lyles came through and won by 5,000ths of a second. Right? It's the same thing, isn't it? Your focus has to be pretty much 360 degrees all the time. And when companies like Google came along, they changed the whole dynamic, because we don't have a research and development department. You guys, all of you, I want you to be the eyes and ears. I'll give you 20% of the working week off to go away from your workplace and workstation and look at developing new ideas, new products. And that is how Google kept developing. And the driverless car was not in Google's strategy. It came from an employee. And Google says, we'll back you, go off and do it. We'll back you. That's where the driverless car came from. There was a guy who's, I think his cousin had been killed in a car crash. And his whole mission in life now was to try and make sure that no cars can ever crash again. So that was the root of the driverless car. So, this thing about creativity, this thing about looking at things in a completely different way, it really lends itself to speaking, because speakers have the power to change the tone of their voice. They've got the power to slow down. You've got the power to tell stories. They've got the power to use a bit of humour. I mean, I was speaking in Glasgow a few weeks ago, and the atmosphere was quite miserable when I arrived. And I just felt, so I said at the beginning, I said, can I say something we're all going to agree on? Life's pretty shit at the moment. And they all went, yes, thank God someone said that. What we don't want is a happy, clappy conference saying everything's okay, right? Anyway, and I thought, no, that this humour's going to work for a while. So I talked about how Glasgow is the funniest city I know anywhere in the world. And yet you look at Glasgow institutions and they're not funny. They're not funny. They're deadpan, they're serious, their public services are kind of driven by bureaucratic thinking, groupthink. And you think, why don't we marry the two together? Because people are funny, genuinely funny. And I was talking about the first day I arrived at my job in Glasgow. It was in Finnieston, and there was a big red based car park out front. So I drove into that. There was a guy picking up with the litter pickers. He was picking up rubber things that were hanging rather long. And I said to him, oh my God, is that I said, is that something you come across every day? He says, oh, I just tell my mates I work on a rubber plantation these days. And it went down really well. You know, that's the kind of wit. That's what people want. They want to embrace serious issues, but they also want to have a bit of a laugh. And they want to hear people saying things that have not been said before, or have been said before in a different way. Can we find a way of wrapping this up in, this is the Play-Doh thing, isn't it? It's the Play-Doh thing, you know. You look at the advertising industry, and they're very good at this, because they've got to grab attention with one single look. They sometimes do it with words, they sometimes do it with imagery. I saw a brilliant one, and it was a company that's bringing Wi-Fi to farmers. So it's Wi-Fi for farmers. That's what it was called. And you know the little symbol, the Wi-Fi symbol. It was quite large on this poster, and each one was a crop field, right? So it said, we're talking to you farmers, you got crops. Did you get that? So rather than just black, 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 they put in each of the little curves, they put in a crop of a different kind. So it spoke directly to farmers, you know, and they would love that, wouldn't they? They would think, oh, well, you know, it's not just an adjustment of a word. This is someone who's going all out to speak to us in our rural challenges when we want to get into, you know, a really competitive commercial space, and we want to be right there, you know, up to the minute, 24/7. So it spoke to them, and that was a hugely successful company. And actually, they had no intention of going for farmers, but someone suggested it. They said, look, there is quite a big market out there. It's a challenging one because A, we've got to get to them, but B, the whole structure needs quite a bit of investment, and I think we're going to have to get a partner in. But they did. So farms now are well connected. But can you imagine the challenges in the beginning? You know, someone's got a sheep farm in the Cheviots. How long was it before they had broadband? Really? And yet they're operating in this marketplace which is very competitive. So that's a way of just using an illustration to show that, you know, they are targeting a particular audience, and they'd run over that audience because they were speaking directly to them and the challenges they face, which I think is pretty remarkable skill. So they got their audience to see with their ears, right? That's what they did. And I want to just touch on that, because when I used to speak, I would knock off, you know, this is what I want to say, this is the point I want to make, this is the point I want to make, this is the point I want to make. Now I have my key messages, and I say to myself, how do I want them to feel? It's a totally different question, isn't it? You know, you say, what do I need to tell them? What do I need to tell them? If you start from that position, you might miss out on something really important, which is, what kind of atmosphere do you want to create? How do you want people to feel emotionally with this? Do you want them to get excited? Do you want them to feel happy? Do you want them to want to do something immediately? And it's just this moving things about. It's about, you know, being creative. And creativity and speaking were never talked about in the same, it's like they were two entirely different disciplines. And actually, when you think about it, they're very, very closely aligned. Particularly with modern broadcasting, particularly with television, particularly with radio. I mean, you don't get bores on radio anymore, do you? Nothing. It goes fast. It goes really fast. So that's what you're in competition with. So when people go to hear a speaker, they, I think, now want to have a bit of a performance, so that they're not bored, so that they understand what's being said, so that you're using the language that they understand and they use. How many of you have seen presentations given by, say, government departments? They're so tedious, because they use their language. They use their language. For example, they used to talk about homes, social housing homes, as units. That was in the language for a long time. Units. Now, people also became units, and this kind of dehumanization of people has, created a resistance to people that want to talk to them about these issues. And I've worked very hard to get people engaged on these subjects which should matter to them, but they would normally resist because they say, oh, we'll get some head honcho talking bullshit. It's just that's what they say. That's what they expect. So never do what people expect you to do. And it's the greatest single piece of advice I can give when speaking. Always have a surprise, a shock. It's like Bono when he was playing at Hampden Park with U2, and he stood and he said, clicked his finger. Every time I click my finger, a child in Africa dies of starvation. And someone, of course, cut through the early evening mist and says, well, stop clicking your fingers in, you cruel bastard. It was Glasgow. But, we've seen that. We also know that all the recent experiments with imagery, and this gives a great clue as to how people want to consume information. Cancer. For years, we would show cancer victims lying in bed with the tubes, looking helpless, looking pale, yellow, pallid. And then they found that their funding was going down and down. Less people were donating because the world had changed. And what they did was, it was Stanford University that did two campaigns, two different routes. And one used the traditional image, and the other used, a picture of someone who was in a spring meadow with a big smile, and she'd recovered. People went for the recovery one. To lift people. So don't, talk about the problems, the drudgerous lives that we lead. Talk about the opportunities, and talk about cancer as this is someone that's come through it. That's what your money gives to people. The chance to live their lives, to play with their children, blah, blah, blah. And this is so important because there is a kind of misery spin that we focus on the problems rather than the opportunities. We focus on the tragedy rather than the absolute, uplifting splendor of recovery. And if you focus on the latter, you will get a far better response than the former. We've now seen this in so many different iterations. All these campaigns that were focused on the problems. How do you illustrate climate change? The only image that really worked was the polar bear. The polar bear kind of symbolizes this larger than life mammal. And if you show a polar bear with this tiny shrinking iceberg and a kid looking hungry, that's the image that had the most impact of all climate change imagery. That was the one. No one's ever met a polar bear. It's out of our world, but we now know the shrinking ice caps are a real threat, and that worked. But that was, appealing to empathy and people's growing love of animals. I think people now relate to animals better than they ever did before. And one man who, to me, is the best communicator is David Attenborough at the age of, he's coming up for 99 now, isn't he? And his broadcasts, he's got this breathless excitement, enthusiasm, and you hang on every single word, don't you? is riveting. And of course, it's got this imagery. It's fantastic. I love his programs because they transport me to somewhere that's so totally outside my experience. They had one recently where they went to deeper in the ocean than anyone had ever gone before. No film crew had done it, but they had the technology to be able to do that. And they were able to show this whole new world of activity. It was extraordinary. And of course, he relates it to, the degradation of the environment is going to affect the beauty and the ecology of our nature. He doesn't force it down your throats. He tells it in stories, because he follows the story of, a family of lions, and the parents have to look after the kids, and the degradation of nature around them forces them, and there's more competitiveness, and the water holes are receding. The little bits of water are disappearing from these arid desert terrains. So there is a real opportunity now. Let's just go through some of what I've talked about. The first one, is there a way I can show it visually? Maybe not. Is there a way I can get people to see it with their ears? Well, yeah. We've got metaphors, we've got analogies. That's a good technique. So you tell a little story that exemplifies exactly the point you want to make. And people will remember that. People will always remember that. And then you think, are there any figures involved in this? Because people might want a bit of scientific or statistical background. And that's fine. But then again, you can be creative with that. You could say the cost of keeping, these lions, free from danger is, 1,000th less than the cost of, repairing the Bridge of London or something, London Bridge. That's a ridiculous one. But you see what I mean? If there's a number, can you look up Google and put that number in? How many windows are in the Empire State Building? I think I can't remember, I've used this before, but use numbers as it's like clay. Numbers can be turned into really exciting little memory points. People love numbers. Not in the very traditional, this is what the figures are showing us today, guys. Not in that way. They love numbers that they can play about with and tell people. People love that, don't they? They love it. And, children coming home from primary school always remember things that they're told, and they get excited about it. Children are creative, endlessly. And, when you're talking about creativity, you have to talk about children. So you say, what's happened to us? When we were toddlers, we were coming up with solutions to all kinds of challenges. We saw things our parents never saw. We were brave, we were bold. We never saw challenges beyond that. What's happened to us? Can we recreate that kind of, I see an answer to that. ScotRail, which for anyone outside is now the national rail company in Scotland, but before that was under Dutch ownership, and they brought primary age children in to help them to solve a problem. The problem was that when they arrived at Waverley Station, there were huge crowds waiting for the train to take off, going back in the opposite direction to Glasgow. And the cleaners were under tremendous pressure. So they were trying desperately, and people were coming on. If they tried to keep the doors closed, people were banging in the doors. I'm sure there's a few people on this who've done that themselves. But they brought these primary age children, I think they were 9, 10 and 11. And they talked about the challenge, and they said, right, you can go up and down this line as many times as you want, just want to see if you've got an idea that can change this challenge and make it life easier for ScotRail and particularly the cleaners. So they went up and down multiple times. They probably had a solution the first time they went over, but they thought, we'll get free train rides. Let's do this. Anyway, they came back and the management of ScotRail said, have you got, has anything struck you? You're young, you'll see things. And they said, aye, bring the cleaners on at Haymarket. And they can start cleaning the train at Haymarket. It takes 5 or 6 minutes to get to Waverley. By the time they get there, they're almost done. No adult had thought of that. Can you believe that? No adult had thought of it, but the children did. So, we are in an era now where I think people want to feel uplifted. I think people want to be told stories. I think people want a bit of spice, and they want optimism. And I think, speakers now, I could never do a talk now where the overarching conclusion was, I've seen it's 1 hour already. The overarching conclusion was, that's painted a very dark picture of the world. People don't want that, and they leave with nothing. They leave in deficit. They've got this curiosity. They want ideas. They want solutions, and speakers can provide that, and they can do it by using images, by using words in a different way, by telling stories, by even a gesture. I saw a one speech, and there was a guy who had a plant at the front of the stage, and the plant was about this size, and somehow or other he got a magician to help him, an illusionist. So at the end of the thing there was a big screen in front of it, and he took the screen away, and the plant had grown almost to the ceiling, right? So that was the symbol of growth, and it just said something. And of course I got a huge applause, and I was sick that it wasn't me that had done it, but it was a gesture, it was a symbolic thing, and it went down a storm. People remembered it. So I know it's 5 o'clock now, and I apologise for going over. I hope that's been a useful introduction. Has it? Any questions or comments? Because I'd be delighted to hear from people, just because you sit here and you think, what's happening in the world,
No, I think it's all inspirational stuff, I think, Mike. And it's a case, I was thinking recently, I heard a fantastic story about Glasgow and Nelson Mandela Place, and how Nelson Mandela Place came to be named Nelson Mandela Place. And it's a fantastic story, and it's typical Glasgow humour.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I thought, I'm not going to take up the whole 5 minutes to tell what the story is, but you should go and look it up, guys. But I thought, I wonder, right, working backwards, reverse engineering, could I try and find a way to fit what I want to say into that story, because that story is just great, and it's Glasgow Gallisness as well that you mentioned.
Yes,
and I thought that's great. There's stories of war heroes that I know, like Polish Jewish war heroes, fantastic stories that we all know. We've all got like our own little things about, that story about that person who did that thing. And therefore I think the trick is going to be, how can I just store up all the stories in my head, write them down in a wee notebook, and then find an excuse to use them. That's the word I'm looking for.
Oh, it's a great one, because Nelson Mandela also loved the Glaswegian humour. He really, he couldn't believe these people who were so dedicated to his cause. And of course, he knew about Glasgow in the prison. I mean, this wasn't, he got out of prison and someone says, got a wee invite for a place called Glasgow. He knew about Glasgow. Yeah. He knew about the commitment and the incredible affection and admiration. I remember hearing the governor of Berlin speaking, ex-governor of Berlin, and he was talking about, the fact that his inmates never get the credit that they should have got for Glasgow's environmental policy. People say, what? He says, yes, They've stripped more lead from churches than any demolition squad could have done. Think of the impact that's had on the removing poisons. I mean, it was just brilliant. And that's the kind of humour that people love. David, so you got your hand up?
Aye, there's tons to unpick in there. That's terrific, Mike. Thanks for that. That was wonderful. Glaswegians, I think they're, as an Edinburgher, a fellow Edinburgher, we've always got that friendly rivalry, but the Glaswegians are the most frank and honest people in the world. That's what I like about them. There's lots to unpick in there, and there's tons there. I've taken a few notes as well. And one thing, like, there was, you love this. I just had a conversation this afternoon with some fellow marketers, because we're talking about marketing and advertising. And he said, I was bemoaning the fact that we've got all these standards in the world for stuff, but we've nothing to actually uncover a need, which is the fundamental premise of any commerce. But anyway, and he said, there's one standard in the world that's to do with marketing, and that's there's a standard for innovation. And I thought, is that not an oxymoron?
Yes, exactly.
Here's a standard.
Here's
a standard, and if you imagine saying that to a kid, using your child's analogies and stuff there. Imagine saying that to a kid, here's a Lego box, but this is the only way you can build your Lego.
No, it's absolutely true. No, and that is exactly the kind of constraint that we can put in people. And language does constrain people because it limits possibilities. Thank you. That's a great example. Dickel?
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, I can.
Yeah, it's actually very, very fun for me to join this session. And actually, it's my first time joining in. And I learned a lot. It's very inspiring what you said, and then something I would like to explore more. Get to listen to you guys more. And it was great to see everyone here and get to listen into the different dialogues that people have. It's really inspiring.
Thank you.
To listen to.
Actually, we'll be announcing very shortly what we're kind of loosely calling a communications workshop, where people can bring any communication challenge they have. And we can workshop, we can finesse it, we can produce something, that little diamond quality nugget of information and the way to express it. It's going to be quite soon, Mayo, isn't it, when we put it out?
That's awesome.
Yeah, so, the thing like the Nelson Mandela one, we can actually, you can bring it to the table and we can say, right, how are we going to do this? How are we going to tell this story? Imagine if it was a documentary, where would you start? At the end or the beginning,
That's awesome. I'm all in. I'll probably possibly more some more to say.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. David. Dave.
Yeah, just share a little story, talking in a bleak fashion. I always get a really good reaction from our audiences. So we got a little technology tool.
Yeah.
It does a whole heap of things. But when I start the presentation, I always say to people, don't think about what it does, how it does it, or anything else. Think about how to present the results from having used it. And use the results and present them in a fashion. Hello, boss. I deserve a pay rise.
Oh, brilliant.
So the outcome from using our technology tool is you getting a pay rise.
Oh, wow.
And what it's done is it's effectively introduced a bit of humour, but it also hooked them in to say, okay, I need to find out how you're going to get me a pay rise now. What does this thing actually do? So
that's genius.
It's a little oblique technique, and as I say, it's worked well.
Yeah. But it engages people, gets them involved. It's got an unknown outcome for them. They don't know what they're fully getting into, but they submit to it, and then they realise that you are making a promise that was true. So I don't think anyone's going to leave feeling more miserable than when they arrived, are they? It's great. Thanks so much for that. I'd like to find out more about that, Dave, actually. That's a really, really good technique. Really, really good. Thank you so much.
I've taken a few notes and really some great advice in there. Really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. You see, I don't have any slides, and I just thought I'm going to talk, because that's what we're talking about, talking. So I hope that format was okay. And thank you so much for coming. It's great to see people back as well for a second time. There'll be more coming up, so I look forward to seeing you again. I'm building this relationship of communication geniuses. Yeah. And let's get Scotland.
Fantastic.
Let's get Scotland as a sort of side issue here. Let's get Scotland out of the kind of this is what we do, guys, into this is what we are going to achieve, guys. You know, it's a totally different energy. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks
Thank
to
you, Mike.
the gallus. Thanks to the
Cheers.
gallusness.
Thank you so much.